I've already done a video. Soundcore Rave Neo takes on the Soundcore Motion Boom and the JBL kind of Xtreme 3. I did all of them in default mode, and as is often the case when it comes to Soundcore, you do get a decent app which will allow you to change the frequency response, and you do normally get some improvement, maybe a little, or in the case of the Soundcore Motion Plus, a hell of a lot. So this video is all about the battle between the EQ modes, but of course it's not about the battle with the EQ mode on the JBL Xtreme 3, because JBL have never given us possibility of changing the EQ because the app, well, pretty much sucks really. You even have to go into the app if you want to pair them in stereo. You don't do that with Soundcore. You've got a dedicated button on the speakers. You can easily pair the speakers in stereo. JBL, in my experience, is the worst for pairing, to the point where you just give up and you just use party mode, because going into the app every time, since the JBL Charge 3, stereo pairing has been a nightmare. EQ settings. Now, out of the box, the Soundcore Motion Boom is a very flat sounding speaker, remarkably flat. For a budget boombox like this, it measures remarkably flat. The only one thing I can say about it though, it does have a boomy bass and it does make it sound a bit muddy, so we can improve that high end a little bit. Yes, it means maybe not as quite as flat as it was, but it will bring out some clarity, some definition. And we're talking about a boomy bass. There is a bit of an upper bass peak, and there's a 150 Hz slider in the app. That 150 Hz area is where most of the boomy part of that bass is centered around. So not just, I'm reducing 150 Hz, not just because it's already got an upper bass peak, but because that's where I find reducing it takes away a lot of the boominess, and it brings out the genuine deep bass, but also hardly pushing the deep bass at all, because A, it's already flat and I don't want to ruin that, and B, because then it will become a bit more boomy. But I think the key to the boominess is that 150 Hz slider. In the case of the Soundcore Rave Neo, well, the frequency response is a bit all over the place. It doesn't measure flat at all. It's basically, I measure this within plus or minus 7 dB. That's a huge range, and that is not flat. There is full of peaks and dips. Having said that, though, you can improve it because you can bring out some of the clarity. Sound, the default mode, which is outdoor mode on this, is not very clear at all. So pushing the upper end, and again, it's got an upper bass peak. Bringing that upper bass peak down a bit brings out that genuine low bass. So that's the tinkering, but the Rave Neo is, I'm still not happy with. It's because there aren't enough sliders to really even out the sound. It's easy to raise the bass, it's easy to raise the high end, that's a no-brainer. But you want the detail in the mids, and that's not so easy because there's too many dips that you can't do anything about. I'm gonna give you a quick listen where we are now. EQ modes on the Soundcore. I'm not EQing the JBL Xtreme. Because it's not fair, you're not EQing the JBL. I'm not EQing it because you cannot embed the EQ into the JBL Xtreme 3. In fact, there's no EQ at all. You could use software EQ. I don't do that. I only use EQ if I can embed it into the firmware of the speaker. So this is a test around 50% volume. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who has the biggest bass of all? It's going to be the oh, hang on a sec. It's not the 280-pound speaker. It's the other two. If I actually get an average for lower bass, I'm saying between 40 and 65 hertz. If I actually average out that whole area, 33.2, Xtreme 3. Remember, nearer you get to 0, the louder it is. 31.6 and 31.8 for the two Soundcores. 2 dB bigger for deep bass. 65 hertz and below on the Soundcores. About £100, about 80 quid. Apparently you can't even get this at the moment. I got it for 80 quid and I got that for £99. Someone asked me where did I get that from, like it's a big secret in the UK. They sell it in Currys. It's on the high street. I'm not sure why you're asking me. Do a quick Google search. It's not the JBL Xtreme 3. When I did my JBL Xtreme 3 versus the 2 and the 1, I thought, hey, that sounds much better than the other two. I've got now a deep bass speaker that I can actually listen to when the others were not balanced enough. Basically because it had more upper bass than deep bass. I know a lot of you actually like the upper bass, but for me, it's deep bass all the way. And I was getting that from the JBL Xtreme 3, and not really from any of my other speakers, certainly that size and smaller. And suddenly, it comes 2 speakers at once. It's like buses. There's nothing there, and suddenly they all come along at the same time, all doing genuine deep bass. But these are doing it for like a quarter of the price, 80 quid, well, a third of the price of the JBL Xtreme 3. Was a big surprise to me. Even sounds probably the most balanced. It's certainly got the most full sound. So I'm struggling a bit with the EQ on the Neo because it's not possible to really sort those mids out. However, it's got a lovely bass. It probably has the nicest bass of them all in terms of genuine deep bass kick, but I did have to reduce that upper bass and maybe suffering a little bit from that. Obviously, these are my early settings, and of course I can be tinkering with them down the line. However, it did measure flatter doing it that way. There's also quite a difference in the signature sounds of the Motion Boom and the Rave Neo. This is a lean, mean sounding machine, and this is a thick, full-bodied sounding speaker. And depending on what kind of tracks you listen to, a lean sound, which obviously gives you a faster, agile sound, and a thicker, deep bass sound like this very warm sound will probably blend better with thinner sounding tracks. But JBL Xtreme 3 now sounds off. Now I've EQ'd these two, and in comparison to me, to my ears, the Xtreme 3 with its specifically tuned deep bass, with its specifically tuned 13 kilohertz peak, doesn't sound right. It sounds off, even though I did like it when I first heard it. Now I'm thinking, oh, how did that happen? How did 2 speakers come along all of a sudden and completely derail everything I was saying about the JBL Xtreme 3? We'll take it up a notch, around 75% volume.
Talk about quiet with a big mouth. Listen for the doubt, then call it. Make you out for what you say to me. Look at every single date. If you got what I need, then oh, I'll take you on like a big deal. Legs you can unseal, key in ignition. Just keep me full like I had a meal once in a while. Feel alright. I know you like the shock waves.
Soundcore Motion Boom, Soundcore Rave Neo, JBL Xtreme 3. In terms of overall response, Xtreme 3 is at its sweet spot and it looks reasonably balanced. We're looking for a linear downward slope, peak at 12 kHz, peak at 10 kHz, and dips in between. The Rave Neo, major glitches, 1300 Hz, 3,500 Hz to 5,000 Hz. And because of those major glitches, and they're big old dips, you really have to boost that high end to make up for it. So not the most balanced speaker by any means. And the Motion Boom, yeah, pretty well balanced. And that big old bass, having to give it a bit of a kick at the high end. Around the 10 kHz it has a little peak just to boost some of that clarity. No major dips. Really one knows got the biggest bass. In terms of upper bass, well, whether it's 150 Hz or 90 Hz, the Motion Boom with my custom EQ, I have dialed down that upper bass. So you find the Rave Neo and the Xtreme 3 have a bit more upper bass, or at least the same upper bass. But certainly at 150 Hz, the Motion Boom is down in the other two, but that's going to bring out the lower bass. In terms of really deep 40 Hz, Xtreme 3 trailing. Can't really go down to 40 Hz. It does 50 Hz well, minus 30, minus 30, minus 30, but no better when you have EQ'd the Motion Boom or the Rave Neo. And at 62 Hz, again, nothing in it between the Xtreme 3 and the Motion Boom. Ultimately, by a fraction of minus 44, the Rave Neo does kick a little bit deeper than the other two, but lots of issues elsewhere. Overall, it's pretty much the same story in the differences between them. However, we're in the sweet spot now for the JBL Xtreme 3 because you hit 80%, the bass doesn't go up at all, and there's not much adjustment, in the lower volumes. Around 75% is where it's going to be most flattering to the JBL Xtreme 3, and the differences are smaller, but they are still there. Even if I do, again, averages for deep bass, then you are looking at 33.8 for the Xtreme 3, 32.4 and 32.3, the two Soundcores. So we're still a decibel up on the Soundcores. For genuine deep bass, I'm measuring the whole range, 40 to 65 Hz, and averaging out, these two have more deep bass. We're getting beautiful, it's a really nice deep bass when it kicks in on the Rave Neo, but if it doesn't kick in, it sounds a bit thin and a bit missing, whereas this is a full sound all the time. Sounds nicely balanced. When you give it that high end lift, you add a bit of clarity back. 80 quid, as ugly and as horrible as it is to look at with the handle, get rid of the handle. What it does is something pretty special for 80 quid, and I don't want to say, oh, new pound for pound world champion, but I don't know. I have to revisit with the EQ against the Motion Plus because I don't know. Is this going to be my go-to? I don't know. Gonna take it all the way up, maximum volume, 100% volume.
Don't look now.
So ultimately, JBL Xtreme 3 does go the loudest, and it goes loudest on battery. And bear in mind, it goes a little bit louder and a little bit deeper if you plug the mains lead in. But let's keep it fair. These are portable speakers. We're not plugging the mains lead in. And when we do that, we're about a decibel up Xtreme 3 in overall terms on the Rave Neo, which is again about a dB up on the Motion Boom. So a couple of dB between the three, but that's not the whole story. The JBL Xtreme 3, as you can see, bass limiting comes in after 80%, which means it's now quite mids heavy. 500 to 5000 hertz, it's now dominating the sound signature with that peak at 13 kilohertz, so not the greatest listen. The Rave Neo, we already know, has major dip issues, and the Motion Boom, again, remains the most balanced. And in terms of bass, both the Boom and the Rave Neo kick deeper into the 40 hertz by 3 dB, which is quite a bit over the Xtreme 3. 50 hertz is the sweet spot for the JBL Xtreme 3, clearly tuned for that, I would say. Minus 38, well up on the Neo, but boom, it's only just beating the Motion Boom, even at 50 hertz, 65 hertz. It's the same as the Motion Boom, so might go a bit louder, but it's a bit more unbalanced, the Xtreme 3, and it doesn't beat the Motion Boom for bass once you've EQ'd the Motion Boom. Weird things going on with the Soundcore Rave Neo, though, unfortunately, and you start hitting maximum volume levels.
Average them out, 40 hertz to 65 hertz. The biggest deep bass, it goes to the Motion Boom. Unbelievably, even though it doesn't go as loud, and it does sound more balanced at maximum volume. It's only a 30 watt speaker, 50 watt, 50 watt. I didn't plug the mains lead in, so I don't know exactly what wattage it's putting out. However, even though it goes a bit louder, most deep bass averaging out is on the Motion Boom. Not by much, but it is the Motion Boom. And the least to the Neo, and there is, as I said, there's a problem with the EQ once you get to the maximum volume. And let me explain.
So problems with the Rave Neo, when you don't use its default outdoor mode. So that looks quite linear. You think, okay, well, we can predict what's going to happen. Unfortunately, when you go to custom EQ, weird things happen. So first of all, notice how there's a big 150 hertz peak in its default mode. And so I have dialed down considerably that 150 hertz peak. And that does do the job of smoothing that peak out. There's the equalizer, as you can see. I'm right down in terms of 150. That looks severe, but the result of pulling that 150 hertz down on the Rave Neo in the app, you smooth out that upper bass peak. But after 80%, when you increase the volume, there's a bass limit on the upper bass. And instead of increasing the upper bass, all the power's going into kind of a mid-upper bass. I wouldn't say it's a low bass. And there's the problem. It's not actually just increasing low bass. It's shifting the peak considerably to around, as you can see, about 90 hertz. So the EQ is off. You would want to have had your 150 hertz level and bring down the 80 hertz there. And there is why it sounds really, really off at maximum volume. The result of that is a lack of 150 hertz area, massive peaks around, well, around 100 hertz here, but obviously because the actual peak's at 90 hertz, this track is 100 hertz, it's giving an unnatural peak at 100 hertz, and you haven't got the lower bass you wanted. So you haven't got the lower bass, the 150 hertz upper bass, but this kind of mid upper bass here is over accentuated. Together with those major dips elsewhere, it just sounds really, really off and isn't in tune with what I intended in my custom EQ.
So if you don't use default mode for the Soundcore Neo, when you go 80% and over, you've got a problem because completely changing what it's doing in that bass area. The upper bass and the lower bass is being changed. It's going to mess with your EQ, even though it works at lower settings. But overall, yeah, the Xtreme 3 goes the loudest, but it sounds a bit screechy, piercing, because there's not enough bass. It's all mids and highs. Stays nicely balanced on the Motion Boom. The Rave Neo, well, just switch to default mode once you get to the really loud volumes. And low volumes, use your EQ, and you get a lovely, when there's low bass, it really does sound really nice. Bigger woofer, bigger tweeter, as you can see. And although it's a mono sound, it's a big sound. I really like what it does with vocals, really projects the vocals, but ultimately a bit too thin. For me, personally, I have to say, you know, I keep getting surprised at what this can do in custom EQ. You're thinking, oh, is that really doing that? You know, and it's kicking it with the JBL Xtreme 3. I mean, that really is one in the face for JBL, I have to say. Deeper bass at maximum volume when they're on batteries than the JBL Xtreme 3. So I will have to do an update. You know, as I go forward, I will tweak the settings to take into account what it does at maximum volume on the Soundcore Rave Neo. But even with the EQ as it is, they're both for me are winners over the JBL Xtreme 3. You know, it's too narrow, the sweet spot for the JBL Xtreme 3, whereas this sounds good all the way, low to maximum volume. Look, it's still a budget speaker, and I don't want to run away with the idea that this is a hi-fi speaker. Clearly it's not. Probably sounds more hi-fi on the Rave Neo, but there's so many issues in the frequency response that it's always going to sound a bit off, but it can, you know, with the right tracks, it does sound, I would sound quite sweet and beautiful actually, and it looks nice with the lights. But this ugly bugger is doing special things with EQ, I've got to say, for 80 quid. So that's my current state of play. Those are the EQ settings. When you go into EQ, clearly it's kicking the proverbial backside off of the JBL Xtreme 3. You know, these are becoming no-brainers. The pair of Soundcore, they both do things very differently, but in a very nice way. You could certainly justify having both of these speakers. You can have both of these speakers and have money left over from the JBL Xtreme 3. So, hope you got something out of my video, and I thank you for watching.